I was just mentioning to Greg and Jeremy about and Amy about meditation and doing sitting meditation, which is very nice. It's a lot of meditation. I was looking at also speaking with some of the nuns, Karma Chuling schedule. I was just looking at it, and I was told that there's a lot of sitting, 5 hours of sitting, 2 talks, 1 discussion, group meeting per day for the people. And so it's very nice when there's a lot of emphasis given to shamatha meditation. Of course, if you're not familiar with this format, then it can become, I think, a little bit, boring or tiring or not really knowing what you're supposed to be doing. But some amount of meditation is always good. I think many people tend to go to many teachings and receive empowerments and receive teachings, and that comes with a lot of blessings, and of course one learns a lot from it. But oftentimes, since the oneself may not be able to bring discipline of formal meditation much, and if the environment in the Dharma centers are also not emphasizing shamatha meditation, then sometimes I think there's just too much material that one collects, and one doesn't have time to digest it a little bit. So sitting and doing a little bit of shamatha is always very good, and analytical meditation, if you have been introduced to it, then applying that also. But being able to devote the time of any weekend practice or weekend teachings and finding enough space and time for groundedness and familiarity with shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha primarily is, I think, very, very helpful. That's very nice. And if you are new, then I think best way I always would say is guided meditation. If there's somebody who's presenting guided meditation, then that's always very good. Continuing with the text of the Perfect Vase, we have been talking about the potentials and really working hard in understanding, recognizing one's inner potential, and beginning to work from the very beginning stages of relating to Dharma practices so as to really work with whatever it is that you most think you are capable of doing at that moment. Hope and fear, happiness and suffering. Hoping for happiness, not wanting suffering, and the fear of suffering and wanting freedom from suffering. If that is the starting point, then on a very personal relationship, on a personal introspection, if you discover that and make that as being very important, as we spoke about this morning, that becomes itself a very powerful way of understanding the Dharma properly and your relationship to Dharma. So this morning we talked about the beginning potential and then leading it up to somewhat what the text refers to as the middle potential. And so medium potential where meditators... Thank you. Medium potential where meditators in their own mind, through exerting effort in mindfulness of karma, cause and effect, can have a much more thorough and a direct understanding of the Four Noble Truths, the first 2 Noble Truths of suffering and cause of suffering. But when one does work in thinking about these 2 truths, then invariably the result from that contemplation will be there must be a cessation. So if the cessation of the cause is brought about, then it leads to the cessation of the fruition of that cause. And therefore, suffering, there should be a cessation, and the cessation of suffering is dependent upon the cessation of the causes that bring about that suffering, that bring about that unhappiness. And so in that way, one begins to say, so the path of the practice, and path becomes Dharma. At such a point, Dharma no longer becomes something that someone imposes on oneself. It is no longer a system to follow. There are no loyalties to follow. There is nobody who actually dictates a path for you to cultivate. Path, or the Dharma, path, the 4th Noble Truth, the path that leads to cessation of suffering, becomes the mindfulness and everything that you need to cultivate within your own life, so that the happiness is achieved, the suffering is something that you are free from, becomes, what should I do? It becomes a simple phrase. What can I do? What are the things that I can develop, that I can do, that can then bring about the aspiration, the fulfillment of the aspiration of happiness? and not being able to suffer. From then onwards, the teachings here say, the perfect Vast says, path becomes just something that one feels naturally encouraged in one's own self, inspired and encouraged to do. And one is no longer dependent upon someone telling you to do it. There is no need to depend upon objects, whether it is teachers, whether it is teachings, whether it is objects of inspiration, but rather it just makes sense that that path of practice that leads to freedom from suffering makes sense in the mind of the meditator himself or herself. And so Dharma permeates within the person, it blends within the person's life. It is at that moment that is said to be the beginning of a meditator's real intention or the potential that this is going to lead to the cessation of suffering, this is going to bring about freedom from the cyclic existence, this is going to generate the happiness that I long for, that I aspire for, and therefore a very internal inspiration to practice the path that brings about this fruition grows in one's own mind, and that is then said to be the birth, the seed of the higher potential in the person. And so path begins to become simply living that path or living that Dharma through which one may be able to fulfill the aspiration of finding happiness in oneself and not having to encounter suffering and pain. And then from this moment onwards, as it says, one can then also cultivate a sense of appreciation that just as much as oneself aspires that, then it's not so difficult to know that this is also aspired by the other sentient beings also. Just as much as I want happiness, others also desire and aspire that happiness. Just as much as I do not want suffering, likewise others do not want that suffering. It doesn't become very difficult for this person to understand and to be able to exchange oneself for the others. At such a moment, then, any meditation and path of practice that leads to the solution of, as we said earlier in the morning, we talked about how mindful can you be such that you do not create any negative actions. And then at such a moment of the greater potential, meditators begin to find one solution, and that is knowing that all karmas can be corrected if mind is trained of one's own self. Since mind dictates the actions of body, it dictates the actions of speech. Likewise, it dictates the actions of the mental capacities and mental thoughts. Therefore, in training mind, if that mind transforms, if that mind transcends, then everything that evolves from this mind in the form of actions of body, speech, and thoughts can also become conducive to the aspiration of happiness and evolve in such ways that the unvirtuous and negative actions that bring about suffering are not created. And so training of one's own mind becomes much more pivotal and a much more sort of a cause of one's own practice, or that which inspires the practice within one's own self. Traditionally, you will find very often times the relationship that a meditator has with the Dharma practices is always said to be that Dharma is like the medicine that cures a disease. But that attitude of seeing the Dharma as a medicine that cures a disease, often we don't see it in that way, and we take on what is the negative relationship, and that is of a hunter hunting for a musk and has to kill a musk deer to get the musk. And so in our attitude, if we don't understand the karma aspect in your own practice, the action aspect in your own path of practice, then we tend to hunt for Dharma. And so Dharma becomes a sense of gratification or entertainment or intellectual sort of consolation, achievement of wisdom, achievement of realization, achievement of these profound ideas, rather than becoming more realistic in our approach of seeing, I have a disease, I have an obscured mind, a mind that is afflicted with ignorance, that is afflicted with the disease of anger, with hatred, with jealousy, with arrogance, and therefore the path of the practice is the medicine that has to cure. When the curing aspect of the medicinal or the curing properties of the Dharma are recognized within one's own self, then doing Dharma in your daily life becomes a sensible thing to do, number one, and a very natural thing to do. Carefulness in your own attitude and in your own conduct becomes a natural thing to do. It doesn't become an ethical issue. It doesn't become having to do something because I am a Buddhist. That dictation or that dominance of somebody imposing rules and regulation, that relationship that you have with the Dharma, the mistaken relationship, no longer occurs, and a much more sort of a very normal, very natural, ordinary relationship of, oh yes, if I want happiness, this is what I should be doing. If I don't want suffering, this is what I should not be doing. That natural ethics grows within one's own self. Natural applying of the path of the teachings and the teachings into one's own life begins to grow in one's own self. Now, in that way, it cannot be. Such a mind, if we were to look at it, if a meditator worked in this way, such a mind cannot be one that will fall into self-absorption. Whenever there is a dedicated approach of knowing karma and how one aspires happiness, doesn't want suffering, and are careful, and you develop mindfulness, such a mind of a meditator never come across a moment where it is unfeeling of the others. When karma is understood, when happiness is appreciated, when one is afraid of the sufferings and one sees the confusion that we unnecessarily create, natural outcome at that moment is a tender heart, a heart that does have sympathy and understanding that this is the same for oneself and for the others. As a human being, we are naturally endowed with basic goodness, basic heart of kindness, the intelligence that is able to see oneself and reflect that on the others, see others and reflect that on one's own self. That's a very natural property, natural quality that we have inherent of one's own self. Therefore, the Mahayana says, at such a moment when your mind begins to really appreciate and find a natural inspiration to walk the path of the practices, there are 7 things that a meditator then needs to cultivate within one's own self. It says, Shendun du sambaham membe kone semchepala, tsawar ma shepa, tin tempa, tin sowa, chamba ningje kawa, tanyum te dunno song. 7 ways of developing bodhicitta in one's own mind that must become the flowering or the sprouting of the higher potential in one's own self. And so when you say path of meditation, I am a Dharma practitioner, I am walking the path of Dharma, I am going to practice Buddhism, I am a meditator. If you are seeing that within your own self, foremost of all, the first step of the 7 is regarding all sentient beings as your mother. And that's absolutely important. This morning, as I said, there are no texts, any liturgies that begin do not have this phrase in the beginning. See all mothers like sentient beings. All sentient beings have been our mothers in one lifetime or the other. It's a very important question that you really look into yourself and say, do you really see that? Do you really take time to regard all sentient beings as your mother? Foremost of all, as a person, as a meditator, believer, and adherers of karma. Karma, cause and effect, life and rebirth. As Buddhists, we talk about thousands of lifetimes. And it is not difficult to understand a close relationship that we have developed with all sentient beings. It would be very ignorant for us to imagine that we do not relate to other sentient beings. Whether you see them as your mothers or fathers or aunts and uncles, that's not the point. But the point is that you do realize the importance of looking at another sentient being and really seeing life in that other sentient being. With hope, with fear, with want of happiness, with not wanting of suffering. And as meditators, we often forget that. It's a very funny situation, strange situation, where we do know all sentient beings require happiness. But on the other hand, when we look at sentient beings, do we really look at them as holders of life? Or do we use them as commodities? Do we see them as objects whose feelings and sensations and whose needs and wants are not at all important when in comparison to our own needs and our own desires? How much is the mind of the meditator truly cultivated with the teachings so that the first thing that a Mahayana meditator needs to do is understand the oneness of all sentient beings, the immense connection, karmic connection that we have with all sentient beings. For me also, it's been very interesting with this particular thing. I've grown up. I don't remember the first time I heard teachings which talked about all sentient beings are karmically connected, that they have been my mother or my father in one lifetime or the other. It's a thing that you've heard so often that you assume you know about it, that you believe it, that you actually are able to follow it. But I think again, it's a experience of mine, so I may have mentioned it before, but very often times when I go back, and that's many years before, as when I started first traveling. When you return back to your monastery, it is in tradition is that as soon as you enter the monastery, the first thing is you go and prostrate to your teacher, and you make and you say you've come back, and so you offer the katak, and you make yourself sort of present yourself to your teacher. And so we used to do that, and every time I would go back, Rinpoche would always say, "Have you been kind?" Nothing. No, how are you? No, nothing. Good morning, good afternoon. How was your flight? So the first thing he would always ask is, "Have you been kind?" And so we'd always say, yes. So we've all been very kind. Sort of go to do that. But I think about some 7 or 8 years ago, at one point, Rinpoche said, "Have you been kind?" And I said, "Yes." We just sort of said yes, or smiled, or bowed, or nodded, or something like that happened. And then he said, "Really?" And then we began to, when he said "really," that made me really think, is about, do I really practice kindness? When I look at Buddhist students, for example, how often does my mind actually function where I begin to see mother-like sentient beings in the others? Then the next time that I spoke with Rinpoche, it was during the time when many changes were happening, and I had a list of complaints about Western students that I would then put forward to me. They don't understand this is that resistance, this is here, and this is there, and so forth. And Rinpoche smiled, and he said, Trijang Rinpoche, my father, he smiled, and he said, you've got to really love them. If you don't love them, nothing much will happen at all. And so that said me that these two incidents have stuck in my mind for a long time, is that it took me a while to begin to understand that, yes, we love, and yet we don't love them as much, isn't it? And until we really love people, you really cannot establish any kind of strong relationship of doing any good at all. Tension, fabrications, different kinds of, probably what would be, I think, summed up as is your own agendas often supersede the genuine care and the genuine love that has been there. So one is my aging, I think, and the other is wonderful teachings, and also this kind of self-reflection that you have it's a very powerful practice, is to wake up every day and to be able to really search in your own self and say, are you really going to love people for who they are, for what they are, or are you going to impose your demands on them and then love them if they sort of agree with your own demands and expectations? So that kind of exercise, self-examination for meditators, is very important. As I said early in the morning today, is that at the time of death, this is what is going to most matter. This is going to be what is most important than any philosophy, than any different kinds of methods. It doesn't matter if we have done 5,000 prostrations or 100,000 prostrations or 500,000 prostrations, if there is no genuine ability to love another sentient being. Why would you prostrate? Why would you sit and meditate? Why would you study the Dharma if those methods were not to instill in oneself genuine loving kindness to another sentient being? When we cannot really, as Buddhists, regard sentient beings as our mother, and this lifetime's mother, and the immense kindness, likewise, we've taken much from everyone else. Khandro Rinpoche, in his teachings, there's a very powerful excerpt in the words of my perfect teacher when he says, you are indebted to hundreds of people for just a cup of tea that you drink. Isn't it? How many people work hard to make it possible for you? And therefore, you have to understand the karmic connection and the karmic debt that you owe to the people who have made that tea possible, the tea leaves, the sugar, the butter, the salt, and whatever different ingredients that you use. And likewise, when I see myself also, there's hardly anything that I myself independently do without relying on the kindness of many, many, many people. And confusion and the basic obscuration of my own mind, the ignorance, is that it doesn't realize that. It isolates its own self in an ignorant way, and it isolates its own self pretending that you are an island on your own, that you're not indebted, that you're not connected to anyone else. And therefore, that kind of rigidity of the mind, that attitude, mistaken attitude, the ignorant attitude, if that itself is not transcended, any teaching that is then in the future given to such a person cannot really fruition as realization in any way. Therefore, fundamentally, the first one that one should develop in one's own attitude is ask yourself the question. Zawar Mashyapa, it says, the root is to regard all sentient beings as your mother. And that is developing immense courage to say, you have been my mother, 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 you've been my mother. How is it that I cannot feel that connection, that indebtedness with one another? If one were able to have the courage of looking into the eyes of another person and see my mother and the immense kindness that I have received from the other person to you, there would then no longer be the question of why to be patient, when to be patient, how much to give, what not to give, the helping and so forth. Patronizing attitude that we bring about in our practice of bodhicitta no longer remains a thing that we can actually keep continuing to do. What would life be other than a method or a mode that would then be able to return that kindness and the gratitude that we receive and feel for the other sentient beings? And so secondly, it says Tindamba, not only regarding all sentient beings as your mother, that simple reflection is insufficient. It has to come furthermore with Tindamba, and that is realizing their kindness. You have to actually sit down and train your mind in understanding the amount and the number of kindnesses that you have received from the others. Just as you can think very easily of number of kindnesses that you have received from people who love you in this lifetime, likewise, number of kindnesses. You have to take in your mind sense of really counting one by one, thinking of all the kindnesses that you have actually received. Kindness for the people who swept the floors, put the cushions, done this, gone through the whole thing of coordination. When I come here and you come here and we meet for 1.5 hours, 2 hours, it takes about roughly around 4 to 5 months of preparation from hard-working people who otherwise would have been much more happier doing something else. But then they make the effort to bring that together. And so all circumstances, when they are thought about, then you begin to have a much more flexible attitude, and the tolerance level towards others begins to become more natural. That kind of tolerance that develops because you understand the oneness, the interconnectedness, and the immense amount of kindness that you have received from the others is the natural transcendence of one's own mind from an irritable mind, from a less tolerant mind to a much more patient and a tolerant mind. And this kind of transformation and transcendence that comes from self-reflection and self-examination is much more powerful than something that has been dictated to you. It's if someone says, as a Mahayanist, you should have patience and tolerance to the others. That kind of adhering to the Dharma is very weak, because you'll always come up with doubts and hesitations and many questions and resistances. And in comparison to that, when you do the self-reflection of seeing sentient beings and how immensely we are indebted to their kindness and their gratitude and their kindness, and feeling that gratitude towards the sentient beings, when you reflect upon all the kindnesses that have been extended towards yourself, an unquestioning certainty of having to be tolerant, of being appreciative of their immense kindness, becomes a much more natural ability and this is much more effective and powerful in making the mind more suitable for Mahayana teachings. Bodhicitta no longer becomes something to apply or cultivate. Bodhicitta just becomes the mind of this individual becoming softer through a maturity of understanding who it is that we are, and as sentient beings, how many sentient beings we relate to. Third thing that the meditator needs to then think about in one's own life is Tinsowa. And so everyone has been we are connected to everyone as our mothers or fathers in one lifetime or the other. Secondly is really remembering their kindness. And then third factor would be is how are you going to repay back that kindness? What do you actually do for sentient beings? Apart from breathing, apart from sending out lots of light, apart from a lot of recitations. Those are all very good. They're all inspirations and reminders. But on that other actual note, given a chance, if someone were to say, can I really help you, or would you like my prayer and supplication? What would you choose? Isn't it? Yeah. Then, likewise, it's the same for others also. You'd like something that you can hold on to. You'd like something to be seen, something that would actually mean something to you. Therefore, in that way, again, mind of a greater potential meditator looks into oneself and says, oh yes, so much of kindness, and therefore, what can I do to return that kindness? And therefore, what do you do as a Dharma practitioner is live a life that can, at every moment, be an expression of how you can repay that kindness to the others. Not because you're superior or a Mahayanist or a Bodhisattva or whatever it is, but because you yourself have received so much. And therefore, giving back, and in how many ways are you giving back, that self-examination, self-reflection becomes very essential. Only through these first three points of developing self-analysis and self-reflection can a person then develop the four immeasurable qualities of the Bodhisattva path. Fourth, therefore, becomes loving kindness. How you can repay that kindness to the sentient being, the best way is to develop chamba, or genuine loving kindness. Unconditionally, and it's not difficult to do. As Buddhists, there should be no arguments. Each day, as you start a day, there should be simple one determination, is that I'm going to be genuinely a loving, kind person. I'm going to exert effort in loving all people unconditionally without any arguments. Doesn't matter who does what. Doesn't matter who argues with me. Doesn't matter who expects or does something in return or doesn't do anything in return. That there is some sense of really giving others the freedom to be who they are and loving them in that capacity as best as I can. When you step forward in doing that, if you are a beginner on the path of practice, you will find yourself simply doing Dharma. If you are a person who's received a little more teachings, you will find this as the best way to come and see how much of the application of the different methods of practices have been successful to you. For example, if you are regarding all Dharma, all phenomena as display of your mind, when you set out to practice loving kindness and you do meet challenges, let's say, then it's a good moment for you to say, oh yes, how much of that view of emptiness or view of everything being a natural display of your mind actually is coming into practice. How much of your mind, how much of your wisdom and the development of Dharma teachings have you been successful in seeing this? And so if you are someone who's practicing, let's say, Guru Yoga, how often do you remember the Guru Yoga's essences and are able to practice Guru Yoga in respect to giving loving kindness, unconditional loving kindness to the others? And therefore, being able to simply go ahead and practice without any kind of display of reluctance or hesitancy challenges the meditator to come face to face with, how many teachings you've received and of which how many are you practicing? How many things do you actually believe in and how much are you putting that into practice? What is your view that you think you have, a Mahayanist, Hinayanist, or Vajrayanist view, and how much of that is then helping you to practice loving kindness? That gives you almost a very practical approach to challenging your own understanding of the Dharma and your own faith, your own devotion, and then begins to really be able to see how far the cultivation of your mind with the teachings has been in your own self. And therefore, loving kindness, unconditionally generating a sense of happiness. Loving kindness is to wish others all happiness. Everyone deserves to be happy. Who is there who doesn't deserve to be happy? Therefore, if you can, as a meditator, do something, say something, think something that can be a cause of happiness to the others, that's a well-spent day, much better than hundreds of mantras being done. Some people who are very, very uptight Buddhists sit and meditate and they practice, and so, we have, I don't know whether it's the same thing over here, but in most places I find people have very little tolerance to anything that disturbs their meditation. And so people are not allowed to ring bells, this, and then if there's a cell phone that rings in the shrine room, hundreds of heads turn and to sort of glare at that person for not putting off the cell phone. Children are not allowed, pets are not allowed. You have to do, there's a sort of zero tolerance in terms of diversities of what this world is like, isn't it? And that's actually very strange because our whole Dharma is completely based upon practicing loving kindness, unconditional loving kindness to all sentient beings, to all the sentient beings that are there. And therefore, being able to see in your own practices how much every day can you practice a wish to have give happiness to the others, and not falling into the pattern of being very dedicated meditators, but at the same time becoming very cold, very, very unfeeling towards the well-being and the happiness of the others. And so what amazes me always is very proper meditators, proper structure, proper form, proper sort of everything is very proper, but within that sort of properness, if there's such a word, properness, I think Greg was saying I can mix my English around a little bit. Yes, so properness. So in doing all that, yet there is a sense of, oh, has this person ever heard a word of Dharma? You meet those people certain times. I'm sure we tend to do that also. I meet sometimes people who are all very proper. They're very learned, they know all the teachers, they know all the lineages, they know all the recitations, they know all the practices, they've read all the right books, they've met with all the teachers. And yet there is something which comes to a point where you think, I don't think this person really has understood Dharma at all, isn't it? Because there's a sense of arrogance, rigidity, it's so cold. It's almost like being in a fridge. And you don't feel comfortable, and you wait for the time where that sort of moment of encounter passes away, and you can just go back to being a little bit more normal, isn't it? Now, in that way, when you look carefully, that's a very dangerous thing to do. You do know about Dharma. We all do. And let's not talk about anyone else. Let's talk about our own selves. It's the same thing. We do know about what not to do. We do know what to give up. We do know what are the different obscurations that we shouldn't fall into. But when we don't practice it, and why we don't practice it is because the sympathetic heart that cares for the well-being and the happiness of the others is never given importance. What is more given an importance is how we can best express our intelligence and how much we know and how much we can teach another person, rather than that doesn't matter. If it happens, that's very good. But the primary thing is, what can you do at that moment that will give happiness to the other person? And I think that's the reason why we practice. That's the reason why we became Buddhists in the first place. And therefore, all the prostrations, all the meditations, all the readings, and all the following of the teachers that you do exert effort into must result into a mind of a human being that really makes important loving another person your religion, your path of practice, your main view in your spiritual practices. Is that what can you say through the day? What can you do that will give happiness to the others? Ningje is the next point here. And so the fifth point in the 7th points here, Ningje, that is compassion. Compassion is like loving kindness. Loving kindness, the emphasis is in trying to find ways of giving happiness and cause of happiness to the others. And compassion has much more, in Tibetan we say Ningje. And Ningje is, Ning is heart, and Je is something, an imprint that is left in your heart. And that's what it is. In English you translate as compassion, and probably in English it means so. But here the term Ningje in the Tibetan word is anything that strikes your heart, that makes your heart feel for another person. That is called compassion. And therefore, in some ways we can say wishing others to be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. Where your whole day's practice as a Buddhist, as a Dharma meditator, your whole emphasis of your life should be is what not to do that will cause unhappiness and suffering to the others. How can you lead a life that refrains from giving unhappiness and cause of suffering to another sentient being? How can you say the things? How can you articulate things in your own mind? What can you do, and how can you do it in so many ways that will lessen harm and hurt and unhappiness and suffering of other sentient beings? Opening yourself up to the world around yourself and seeing pain, seeing suffering, seeing discontentment, seeing loneliness, seeing immense sadness in yourself as well as in the others, and genuinely working hard so that for even a brief moment, if you can find reasons and find ways where you can alleviate the unhappiness and the suffering of the other person, then making that as your religion, making that as your path of the practices. This is then practicing bodhicitta more effectively than a long-term planning of someday getting enlightened and then coming back to serve humanity and so on and so forth. When it happens, we'll see. But at this moment, that's when that is just something that we are aspiring towards. Main thing is correct your behavior, correct your attitude. Your own self, the recipient of all these teachings, holder of the precious human existence, where the inherent Buddha nature is primordially intrinsic of your own self, you have the capacity of giving happiness to the others, and that's what you should do. You have the capacity not to inflict harm and suffering on the others, and have the capacity to remove and lessen and free others from unhappiness and suffering and causes of unhappiness and suffering, and therefore training yourself truly to practicing these two, the loving kindness and compassion in your actions of body, speech, and mind, becomes essential. Sixth point that the meditator then needs to work in developing the bodhichitta spirit, or the potential of a higher person, is joyfulness. One must, extremely important, I would say, of all the qualities that meditators can develop, one of the most important and one of the most difficult thing is this gawa, or joyfulness, especially joyfulness in the accomplishment of the others. Every day as a meditator, one must train in looking outside of your own self and finding causes to celebrate good things that are there. Spiritual practitioners, with the language that we use, often become a group of very critical, bitter people. That's just the psychological effect, I think, of the language that we use. There's so much of a comparison between samsara and nirvana, of what is obscuration and what is wisdom, that without knowing, we develop in our own selves a very critical attitude. Sometimes, while that is helpful in terms of discerning between what is to abandon and what is to cultivate, but if it is not worked out in a proper way, we become very critical and bitter about everything that we see negative, or that which we then refer to as being unvirtuous or negative actions. And that often kills the ability to be really looking at the positivities, looking at the good things in the others. As meditators, simple things, as if two people are there that are enjoying a conversation, meditators' ability to really celebrate their conversation, just to be happy that they are able to have that conversation, rather than the bad habit of saying, those are ignorant fools who are wasting their life, not realizing how precious the human body is, isn't it? If you look carefully, that's often, we may not say it in so many words, but this is often the attitude that we begin to develop. Where the joyfulness is not there in the minds, which really is happy for the accomplishment of the others, we begin to not realize how jealous we become. And then, again, in our own minds, we sort of are trying to always walk the path of Dharma. And because of that, we often have also this very strong good thought about wanting to benefit other sentient beings. And in that race, often what happens is we always will gradually begin to feed on our ego, which assumes that it's all now up to you, that you have to be the one to be giving. You have to be the more loving person. You have to be the one that liberates the other person, forgetting very often that very often, more than the giver, we have to be the receiver. And so the gracefulness with which we can receive other people's kindness, we don't like that idea very much. It's always our own self that has to be the liberator. That others may do it for you never occurs to ourselves. And then we become more and more worried, more and more worried. In the other, instance or example of lacking in joyfulness is competitiveness, where meditators begin to compete with one another, not realizing that competitiveness inward. And then the only motivating factor for you to do is group pressure. Others are prostrating, therefore you prostrate. Others are taking refuge, therefore you take refuge. Others are going into retreat, therefore you go into retreat. And you think that you're being inspired, but oftentimes it may simply be out of a very competitive nature, a jealous nature within one's own self. So nuns are here, and I think this is always something that I tell them also, is that retreat centers often are good impressions, is that meditators go into these 3-7-year-long retreats, and around the first year, when their initial enthusiasm dies down, the only thing that many of them get by with is competition with the other retreatants. Just because the other person wakes up at 4, you wake up at 3:45, isn't it? The other person. But when that sort of competitiveness comes in, and you compare your practice with the other practices, There are a lot of things are brought in about that. If a teacher speaks to a student a little bit longer than to another person, your mind begins to immediately question your whole belief system. Does Dharma work for me or not? Is this lineage the right lineage for me or not? Is my Guru Yoga weaker than the Guru Yoga of the other person? Everything begins to strike in your own mind. These different aspects, which immediately create doubt, hesitation, discouragement, jealousy, unhappiness within one's own self, are only because of lacking in joyfulness, in lacking in really understanding that there is goodness in everything that you are doing. Goodness in the day that you have, goodness in the moment that you have, goodness in the closeness that you all have together, goodness in the evening to come, goodness in the next day to come, goodness in this moment. And it's entirely under your control at this moment how you want to see it, how you want it to be manifest. And therefore, joyfulness is a very essential practice. Simple thing. One is, joyfulness is generate joyfulness in what you have been able to achieve so far. Preciousness of human existence is a cause of great celebration, great joyfulness. Joyfulness in the exertion that you exert effort in at this moment. Third is, be happy for others. When another person practices well, be truly happy for that. If another person is happy in this moment, be truly happy for them at this moment. If another person is more successful, higher ranking, closer to the teacher, is mentioned more often or whatever it is, truly being happy at the accomplishment of the others. And very essential is, do not be jealous when someone else does better than one's own self, but be able to really be kind and happy at the achievement and the accomplishment of the others. This is very, very important. If joyfulness is the practice that a meditator could implement in one's own life, I don't think we would have the necessity of having anything such as schisms in sanghas, or politics in spirituality, or this whole issue of organization and organizational politics that we have. Any difficulty, any problem that we have, despite the fact that we're all supposed to be studying Buddha's teachings on emptiness and compassion, that we still struggle with these issues is simply because of this missing factor. We have loving kindness, we practice compassion, but we do not have the joyfulness in the accomplishment of the others. And therefore, we are happy when I am compassionate. We are happy when I am loving and kind to the others. But if others are doing it to me, then we are not so happy, isn't it? There's no reason. We can't say why we are not so happy if I am not the doer, but we definitely do not celebrate in joyfulness at that moment. And that is, again, just another remarkable display of our own arrogance and our own ego. And so in that way, again, really training to work, and as the teachers over here it says, is of all the 7 essential points, Gawa Gomba, the meditation on joyfulness is essential. Start with small things. Be happy for the achievement of Buddha. You wouldn't resent that, isn't it? And so spend time really being happy that the Buddha did it. Then if you can go a little bit beyond that, think about all the bodhisattvas who accomplished also and did remarkably well without your help. They were all able to do it. And so be really happy about it. Now if you can release that fact that, things can go well without your input in it, then go a little bit beyond it, include your teachers and say, oh yes, be happy at their accomplishments. Then look around those people that you don't get along with and say, what's the difference, isn't it? They can get along, they can be happy, they deserve to be happy, they can be accomplished, they can get what they wish, they can be successful, they can win. And it's not so bad. And that if they are happy in their winning the argument, then that's very good. You wish them well. If they're happy that they have sort of quarreled and gotten something that you felt was not justified at that moment, just as you were happy for the Buddha's accomplishment, be happy for them. As a meditator, it is not for you to win. It is for you to be compassionate. That is your most important practice. Therefore, in the happiness of the others, always find your happiness. Be able to truly be joyful when others are able to achieve, and come outside of the 8 worldly dharmas, that everything has to be about gain and loss. So when you are able to free yourself from hope and fear, from your own gain and loss, your own self-agendas, and the sort of realization of your own agendas, and you can truly practice giving selflessly to the others, At such a moment, all the very complicated teachings about letting go and breathing out thoughts and labeling thoughts no longer become so necessary. When you sit in meditation and you look at what is the nature of thoughts, thoughts are empty, therefore there's nothing to grasp, to let go of thoughts, that they are emptiness in this way, and you dissect a thought and you analyze it, and where does it come from, where is it now, where is it going, and you do all the shamatha, vipassana, and the trekchö and the thoga. Why do we do all this? It's to make it a little bit easier that you don't embroil yourself in this unnecessary struggle all the time. But if you're happy for the achievement of the others, drop it, leave it, label it, blow it out, breathe it in. Doesn't matter, isn't it? And Dharma becomes simpler for you to practice, and all these complicated things are no longer necessary. So in some ways you can, let's say, Vajrasattva meditation, you sit and meditate, and then there's a Vajrasattva that arises from the Hung syllable, and then there's the 100-syllable mantra that rotates clockwise, and then there's the Amrita, it drops down your head and then showers, and then there are all the Mara beings that are opening their mouth, and then all the dirt water flows in them, and all sentient beings, and then everything dissolves into that Hum, and then sometimes the Hum rotates, sometimes doesn't rotate, isn't it? So this is a whole complicated thing, and it's a very helpful method. And it's a method that is very, very, if used correctly, of course, it inspires a person to realize the same thing. But in some ways, why complicate it that way? Is there really a seed syllable that rotates clockwise or anti-clockwise or so forth? No, it isn't there. You do know that. Even those who study Vajrayana and secret mantrayana meditation and understand the purpose of these methods will know that ultimately it is not there. It's part of training the mind. Training the mind to do what? Training the mind to stay away from harm. Training the mind to stay away from creating unnecessary friction between yourself and the others. And if you look at human mind and the capacity and the potential of human mind, it's very easy to understand that where everyone is interconnected, and everyone wants happiness and doesn't want suffering, why do we do it? If you keep that basic question at heart, and you really find your sense of responsibility as a human being to be able to work with that, that itself becomes the most easy, direct way of taming one's own mind and freeing your mind from unnecessary attachments, aversions, grasping, and so forth. Therefore, the natural outcome becomes tangyum, or the seventh point here, which simply is then said to be equanimity. And equanimity is, again, can be explained in many different ways, but equanimity, perfect equanimity, is where mind is truly free from bias and partiality. This is mine and that is theirs, and his is this and his is mine, the unnecessary. As it is in mundane world, there are all these bias and partialities that we unnecessarily bring in. But if we just look at our own spiritual world itself, then unnecessarily we bring so much bias. In terms of schools of Dharma, in terms of lineages, in terms of so on and so forth, immense amount of bias and partiality we cultivate. Even in some moments such as giving of a kind speech or any act of generosity, mind immediately begins to struggle with bias and partiality. Those that are ours, it's so easy to forgive, so easy to forget, so easy to be sort of extending towards them. And anything that has nothing to do with the achievement of your own benefit or the realization of your own self-agenda, then we begin to find complications and complexities and difficulties and obstructions in being able to accomplish that. That's a very biased and a partial mind. And therefore, seventh point is being able to train in your own mind and see, why do you bring so much bias and partiality within one's own self? Bias and partiality even among two siblings. Bias and partiality among Vajra brothers and sisters. And bias and partiality in lineages, in your path of the practices, in your family, among your friends. And so as a meditator who's heard the teachings on what the nature of mind is, who's heard the teachings of the Buddha in all the different forms of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana teachings, at some point, if you've really listened to the teachings, you would have come to a point where you do realize the non-necessity of any discrimination, any bias and partiality within one's own self. In going through all the previous 6 stages, evolved sentient beings have been our mothers in one lifetime or the other. We've received immense kindness from all of them, and you really have to repay that kindness. And if you have loving heart and a compassionate attitude, and you are really going to practice joyfulness at the accomplishment of the others, where is then any room where the mind could then suffer from bias and partiality? Where would be the excuse and the reasons, logic behind having that bias and partiality in yourself? But in actually practicing, we'll always find discrimination come, isn't it? So at any certain level, your country, your culture, your family, your people, your nearness and the farness, the loyalties and the different kinds of sensibilities, all of these different issues come about where you will find that your mind challenges constantly the discrimination that we've become so very accustomed to. It is in practicing equanimity, non-bias and non-partiality that a meditator begins to then really come face to face with the two truths, relative truth and the absolute truth. Mahayana teachings begin to have a much more direct understanding, and you begin to understand why Tonglen is so very important, why the exchange of yourself and the others is so very important, is because here, following the 7 points in your life, if you really take the 7 points of practices as a greater potential, building on the lesser and the middle potentials, foundations, you come to then a much more accurate understanding of the wisdom behind the way Mahayana teachings have been taught in these many different ways. Otherwise, we always will say, well, what is the necessity? I have a tender heart. I have a compassionate heart. But when you actually put it into practice and you try to challenge yourself to do it authentically, then you begin to see that it's different from thinking and actually doing it. There are two different ways. And when you begin to find how easy it is to succumb to not doing any of these 7 points, your mind is not partial, your mind is not impartial or unbiased. Likewise, you have difficulty in generating joyfulness in the accomplishment of the others. You forget to be compassionate. You forget loving kindness. You forget to give back the kindness you have received. You forget to remember the kindness you have received, and you forget sentient beings altogether, isn't it? So when all these 7 points that are simple things that a meditator always assumes to have within one's own self, we then begin to find how much dependent we are on the different methods of practices. Therefore, the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas found it necessary to actually say, there are 7 points how to correct your posture. This is the way you breathe. This is the way you think. This is the way you breathe out. This is the way you breathe in. In breathing in, you should do it in this way. In breathing out, you should do it in that way. And we find the wisdom behind all the methods that have been given to us, simply so that we can come back to understanding honestly within our own selves and find the difference between theoretical understanding of the Dharma and actually living the Dharma, actually practicing the Dharma in our own lives. Therefore, in the teachings of the Mahayana teachings of Bodhisattva through the Asanga's teachings, it has always been said that you should not give the Bodhisattva vow to a person who has first not walked on these 7 points. You have to try and walk the 7 points in your life, cultivating the practices, and then challenging yourself until you come to a point where you say, other than taking the giant leap of committing myself to the Bodhisattva path, I never will come to a point where I can be genuinely unbiased, loving kindness and practicing loving kindness and compassionate to the other sentient beings. And so that readies the mind completely in being able to truly exert effort in practicing the teachings within one's own self. Furthermore, and so as Chukitrapa here in his commentary says, furthermore, when these essential 7 points have been cultivated in the meditator, and meditator exerts effort truly in practicing these 7 points, you will invariably face many, many challenges. And those challenges then have to be further encountered and taken to the path of the practices. It is at that moment that you will really challenge yourself to seeing how far do you really want to practice bodhicitta. So the concept of bodhicitta, very pleasant attitude of we should all become bodhisattvas practicing bodhicitta, is really something that one begins to see what will it take to really practice bodhicitta. And so these are then called the 4 challenges, lamchershi, or often in the traditional text they are called 4 things to take to the path of practice. But also sometimes we refer to them as the 4 challenges. Midaba lamdo cherwa, zokawa lamdo cherwa, jurgu lamdo cherwa, chagdang lamdo cherwa. First is the challenge when you take these 7 points into practice, the challenges that you will meet, and therefore how a Mahayana meditator should take this challenge up are these 4. And the first one is called taking to path the undesirable. When you're practicing loving kindness and compassion and trying to practice joyfulness or equanimity, of course, many times you will encounter undesirable things. And therefore, what should you do? Is make friends with all the undesirable things and transform that into the path of Dharma. If you're serious about practicing Mahayana, this is what one should be doing then. And so that is therefore called taking to path the undesirable. Second is Zokawa Lamdu Cherwa, and that is taking to path what is unbearable, something that you can't bear anymore, intolerable or unbearable. Jurgu Lamdu Cherwa is the third one, and that is taking to path acquiring and separating. When you acquire, how to take acquiring to path of practice, and when you are separated from something, how to take that separation to the path of practice. Chagdang Lamdu Cherwa, and then fourth is taking to path desire and anger to the path of practice. And so this section I will read out in Tibetan and then go through a little bit of translation. Of the 4, the first one is then said to be taking to path what is undesirable. Suda Ducheng Wangi Daginor, Tamche Chogam Chog Jugna, Ludan Loncho Tusum Kiawanam, Delahua Jasela Lihin Sum. In the root text it says, whatever is taken away from you, whoever is there that is powerful or that is more strong than you, whether with on the sly or whether with a tremendous exertion of power, takes from you something that you like very much, when something that you really have or what you want is taken away from you, whether it is your body, whether it is material wealth, whether it is merits or whatever it is. As a person dedicated to the path of the Bodhisattva, one should freely let it go. So don't be afraid of it. If something that is what you really want and that is being not given to you, and you have to face a very undesirable situation, as meditators, one should be able to practice that completely. Dagi nyepe ti dorji digba chenji temper neso, nyegur nyepa tume jungne yimbecher, de topala gawa jebar mirikte, nyegur geksu she goso, nor topar jebani semji chingwa rajunjis. If there is a certain position that you do not want, but you're given that position to do. If there is a certain responsibility that you do not want, and you're given that to do. If there's something you really want, and that is not given to you. If there is some kind of a lifestyle or some material thing or practice or whatever it is, solitude or whatever it is, a holiday that you really want, it is not given to you. As a person on the path of training on the Bodhisattva's path, one must take that challenge and be able to say, you let it go. If you find it possible to simply be happy in the outcome of whatever the situation is, you should really be happy at the accomplishment of your meditation. You're really meditating properly. If not, sin is here, disease is here, it's a time to bring them together, isn't it? And so as all the teachers, great masters have said, if you are afflicted, sort of suffering from a disease, and you have a whole shelf of medicine, but you never take it, but you visualize the medicine every day, and you make 3 prostrations to the medicine every day, and you hope that someday the medicine will itself, do a miraculous thing, but you never take it yourself. You never exert the effort. Medicines are powerful, and they may have the curing abilities, but simply by putting them on the shrine, that's not going to help you at all. Likewise, Dharma that you have as a view and a belief, if that is not applied at the crucial moment, then simply following the principles of Dharma in an intellectual way, that's not going to be helpful to you at that time. Therefore, it is essential. Here it says, whenever a meditator encounters difficulties and unbearable situations, perna, as it says, ben matsugna damipo. If you don't place a target, no matter how skillful an archer may be, the arrow never strikes the target, isn't it? If you have a very skillful archer and he shoots many arrows will just fly in every other direction. If you put a target there, then the skillful archer's arrow hits the target. Therefore, in the same way, if your mind itself is always obscured and it is distant from that compassionate heart, then there is everything that is going to be adverse. Everyone's going to challenge you all the time, isn't it? But if the mind of the meditator itself is transcended and it is transformed into a compassionate heart that is not always affronted, the ego is not always affronted, then the target itself is not there, no matter how many people shoot left or right, wherever it is. The hurt factor, the intolerance that we feel, the unbearable situation that we feel, that doesn't happen. And therefore, do not place the target of your own ego, of your own arrogance, of your own inability to really practice kindness and compassion. And at that moment, one will find that all adverse circumstances, no matter how difficult they may seemingly be like, but still will be easier for the meditator to practice. And therefore, at such a moment, clear self-reflection. Therefore, whenever we encounter difficulties in our life, when things are not going your way, when unbearable situations or what you do not want happens in your life, that's the moment where you should return back to your own cushion or return back to your own practice and understanding of the Dharma and be able to really apply it. And otherwise, peaceful moments when everything is serene and peaceful, then one has immense love and compassion to the others. But at the crucial moment when your own self and self's want is then sort of being challenged, then one doesn't and cannot relate to the teachings. That then I think is very unfortunate and often speaks volumes about a meditator not having really reflected on the teachings. And so even in the sort of monasteries and the nunneries, we often are always looking at this kind of situation where people are by and large very peaceful and very good practitioners. Even in sanghas, I think it's the same thing. I can't say just monasteries, but everyone behaves and everyone is kind and gentle and so on and so forth, as long as everybody has their space and everybody has their own, whatever you want, your own framework is safeguarded. But always when something that you really want is taken away, that is the moment where you really begin to see the true face of the meditator. And so in Tibetan we have a word where we say the clicking of the heels of the meditator's gone louder. And that is when things are not going your way, your feet itself begins to click harder on the floor. And so it's sort of the harshness of your body and everything is there. Even your meditation face goes redder and redder and redder and redder and purple and blue and black, and then so the colors rise up your face whenever things are not going your way. Those are the moments where meditators need to check within one's own self and see how far have you come with applying the teachings at that very moment. If at that moment you're not applying the teachings, then why are you practicing in the first place? Why are you meditating in the first place? Why do you follow teachers in the first place? Why are you actually doing the Dharma practices? Similarly, Zoka wa lamdo cherwa, secondly, as it says, taking to path all the unbearable situations or the sort of difficult situations, as it says, Dagla nyepa chungse meishindo kanda dagi goche jenaus, without any fault of your own. If others are after your head, isn't it? If others are blaming you, you haven't created any mistake, you didn't do anything, but you've been blamed for that situation. With great compassion at heart, you can take the blame on yourself. Now, what's the big deal? That should be the attitude of the meditator. If it makes everyone happy, that's very fine. You're the one who left the door open and then so on and so happened and so on and so. And we become very defensive. And no, I should clarify my stand here. I should stand up for my own self. And especially in the modern world today, there's a sense of I shouldn't become the doormat. I shouldn't let things go by this way. You have to assert yourself. And this is your right and so on and so forth. It's all very fine in the mundane world. But as people on the path of the practice who are really more sort of on the path of generating happiness for the others, of course, if it is something that is harmful for the others, there is still room to argue about it or look at it in a different way. But in most cases, what's the big deal? It's so much easier just to say, okay, and then to go along and to be able to really take what seems like a very difficult situation to the path of your own practice. After all, that what is being hurt the most at that moment probably is nothing other than one thought, isn't it? Thought of the ego. And so many times things can be kept short and sweet, without it becoming into a big drama of one's ego over the other person's ego. There's no end to it. Rangi parla nyopa jepa tabi nyopa chungze ya mejing, without having harmed somebody else intentionally in any way. If the other person is really angry at you, if the other person is really very insulting to you, if the other person is really looking for ways to harm and hurt yourself, one shouldn't be angry. Bodhisattva path is where at such a moment one feels sympathy towards the confusion of the other person, but anger in one's own mind should not occur. Dikpa sabchen dena tabu chebi change dungal nyawar jurwe tela ningje sambe dei juji dikpa. If possible at that moment, reflect more strongly on karma, cause and effect. Cause and effect is anger that leads to more negativities. You then not only face the harm and the hurt of the other person, but you yourself create tremendous negativities within your own self through anger. That then brings on chain of even greater suffering that doesn't end at this moment, but continues to be on so. To that matter, again, karma, I received a letter this morning from one of you who talked about, is karma and destiny the same? And karma and destiny are similar, but they're not the same. Destiny is sort of more defined and structured and more rigid in its sort of way of explaining things, whereas karma is very flexible. Past karma is not so important from the Buddhist perspective. Past karma is very powerful, it is influential, but present karma and the future karma is what is most important from the Buddhist perspective. More than future is present karma. Because this present karma is the moment where you can transform anything of the past to actually become good. So destiny would be is where it's already prearranged and therefore you cannot change it. Karma is not like that. Karma can be changed at any moment. So over past, if you are creating a karma that has somebody really being mean and hurtful to you at this moment, with greater mindfulness, you can actually seize that moment where you can exhaust all seeds of past karma's aggression and actually make it into something that is very good, something that is very positive within one's own self. Therefore, here the text is, at such a moment, rather than giving into anger, check into your own self and see how much more mindfulness can you develop in terms of not creating negative karma. At such a point, many times we will say, oh, but this doesn't seem like a good thing when other people are blaming you for something that you did not do. How can you actually be very passive at this moment, and would it not be better sense to actually correct that other person? This question will often come if the lesser potential isn't what you worked with very much. But if you've spent time really thinking about what we spoke about this morning and last night, is about happiness, and you really want happiness, and you really don't want suffering, and then you begin to reflect upon the power of karma, if you've really given that thought, the challenges that you face now will not be so bad. The understanding of karma and what we can create, the power of giving in to anger and the power of that fruitioning of the anger, what it can create, the suffering it can create, that understanding itself, if it is very acute in one's own mind, at this moment, being patient rather than giving in to the aggression that you feel when another person insults you will be, I think, much more easy to deal with. And therefore, all of the basic and the very fundamental and the very basic root contemplations of the meditator are essential for gradual progress on the path of the practices. If a madman approaches you, if there's a person who really has mental difficulties and is absolutely crazy and you know that person to be mad, points a finger at you and say, you are totally mad. How hurt would you be? Isn't it? Because the person is crazy and you know the person to be crazy, you don't take it that seriously. Likewise, when everyone is suffering from anger, when everyone is deluded, when everyone is suffering from obscurations of mind and there's excessive display of ignorance and aggression, as a meditator, you can simply take that also in the same way. Is that affliction of a disease is affliction of a disease. the anger, the confusion, the ignorance that other people are suffering from, you can tolerate, you can generate the tolerance when you begin to see the madness that is there rampant in and around our own selves and around ourselves in this world. And therefore, how seriously, how important are you going to make empty words? And therefore, be able to practice tolerance, be able to really correct one's own self and train one's own self, challenge and see one's own self in taking to path all the unbearable situations or the difficult situations. Gajik dala minyan hatso dang tongsong chapar drobar chenaya. Jambi semje laryan teniji yunden joba jase lale yinsong. Then in terms of taking to path, the third one, and that is acquiring and separating. In the verse, the root text, it says, if somebody blames you in the beginning, even dala minyan hatsopa, in the presence of everyone, if somebody is saying something very critical to you, and that slander or the gossip completely sort of is known by everyone around your own self. Even at such moment, one should practice genuine loving kindness, and rather than develop a revenge of speaking something bad about the other person, one must exert effort in praising the other person. Think of a good quality of the other person and be able to then share it with other people. And so in the commentary it says, even if directly or indirectly, if someone really slanders you, if someone really insults you, if someone blames you for things that are not true necessarily, at such moment, a meditator on the path of practicing the Bodhi must really look into one's own self and see, how much are you able to really let that go? How much are you able to really transcend at that moment in developing patience? And so all the 7 points. Are you able to see the person as your mother and father? Are you able to think of their kindness? Are you able to repay their kindness? How much loving kindness are you practicing towards this person? How much joyfulness are you now able to practice the achievement and the victory of that other person? How much equanimity are you able to keep in your own mind? If you are able to keep that if all these things are being able to be practiced, then one can truly refer to oneself as practitioner, meditator. But at any moment, if those different challenges are there where we cannot seem to find the 7 points being able to practice when these challenges are being met with, then again you have to look back and see how much more methods you have to apply in your own practice, how much more teachings you need to do, how much more seriously you need to practice in labeling thoughts, in examining the nature of thoughts. What are the different forms of practices that you need to learn that can allow the mind to be less caught up in these different distractions? And check in your own self and see, oh yes, how is that unbiased, selfless compassion going to be developed? What does cessation of suffering and ignorance mean to you at that moment? And again, checking in with the different kinds of challenges that you have, taking that to the path of practice is essential. And likewise, when you acquire things and you forget Dharma, when good things happen to you, when all positive circumstances come together and one forgets the Dharma, very oftentimes, because I relate to a lot of retreatants, there's a very interesting factor. People register to apply for retreats, and then they have a long time of planning. Sometimes their plans don't go according to their own strategies, and accidentally they acquire something. Then registration for the retreat always is cancelled, or it is postponed until the next 3 years, until they can sort of spend the money they have just inherited, or buy a few number of more things and then go on that vacation they've never been able to do. So acquiring often deviates the mind from, again, the practices. Likewise, separating. Some people are not ready to go into retreat, and so they apply maybe after the 3rd year retreat, so the next after 4 years. But their husband leaves them, or their wife leaves them, or they lose their job, they immediately reapply immediately for the next immediate round. And so acquiring and separating often is a struggle that we always have in our lives. But if the acquiring and the separating of anything, whether it is big things or whether it is simple things, acquiring compliments separated from the compliments and the praise, acquiring a position, not acquiring a position, separated from the position, whatever different situations one may be, but if it influences your mind in meditation, your loving kindness, your compassion changes with these acquiring and separation. That again is not being able to take to path the true motivation to the path of the Dharma practices. Therefore, even when one acquires material wealth, good health, or whatever positive circumstances are there, mind of the meditator must be unshaken and indestructible in practicing loving kindness, compassion, genuine joyfulness, equanimity, unbiased equanimity, really reflecting upon the kindness and the sameness of want of happiness and not wanting of suffering of all sentient beings. At the moments of separation, again, separated from happiness, separated from good and fortunate or favorable circumstances, again influencing where your mind becomes discouraged, where your mind becomes again very, very fearful of the self or the wishes of the self, and your own self becomes very important, depression sinks in. These again, if it is influencing, again, acquiring and separation, both of the situations must be taken to the path of practice, and taken to the path of practice is the same. You look inward and you begin to see, why do you still succumb to this? Where is your previous understanding of karma? Where is your previous motivation of actually practicing the teachings and being able to really cultivate the bodhicitta in all circumstances? Likewise, in the fourth taking to path, chagdang lamdu cherwise, when desire, strong desire arises, powerful enough that you lose track of your motivation to practice bodhicitta. Or when anger comes in and you lose again touch with your motivation to practice bodhicitta, like in the previous three sections, these two also are very pivotal. At every moment we try to practice compassion, loving kindness, and equanimity and develop joyfulness, but when self and self's agenda are attacked, and your own space is attacked, your own wishes are attacked, at that moment you drop and pretend almost you've never heard a word of the Dharma, never been ever encountered teachings, and your behavior completely falls back into its own obscured ways of behaving or reacting to situations, also speaks volumes of how weak one's foundation of meditation is. Therefore, Mahayanists, or those who are training to develop bodhicitta, the essence of the Mahayana teachings, must examine by taking into consideration all these factors. When you meet with unbearable situations, when you meet with undesirable situations, when you meet with all desirable and very perfect acquired situations of great acquiring, or when you're separated from what you have acquired, in moments of desire, in moments of aggression and anger, if there is stability and you're able to remain the same person, being able to practice all the 7 points consistently, that then is good meditation. That is where you're truly understanding what bodhicitta is, what Mahayana teachings are. You do not have to question your devotion to the teachers and the path of the practice. You do not have to be uncertain and hesitant about your refuge. But if these conditions, these 4 conditions of unbearable, undesirable, acquiring and separating, desire and anger, influences and are powerful enough that you forget the 7 points when you encounter these situations, then one must keep in mind how important it is to strengthen one's hearing and hear accurately, how much more meditation one needs to practice, how much more truth and honesty one needs to develop in one's own life, knowing that at such a moment, if your mind is not stable with the bodhicitta, with the compassion, loving kindness and compassion for all sentient beings, mindful of the karma that you are creating, then you are falling into the category of meditators who are more preoccupied with the sort of methods of the practices. And methods of the practices are all useful, but they're only methods, and therefore they're not the full realization of the solutions. I've always given the example of different tools that we may use, and common example that I give is of a person who's been told to hang a picture. If I tell you to hang a picture on the wall, you'll need a hammer and nail for that, isn't it? And so you take a hammer and nail and you hammer the nail in the wall, and then you hang the picture on it. But if a person is told to hang the picture and you're given a hammer and a nail, and you become so fascinated with the hammer and nail, isn't it? That you begin to supplicate the hammer and nail, you're enamored by the hammer and nail, and so you begin to be preoccupied and you forget the hanging the picture completely. That is then where you get Mahayana teachings, you get Vajrayana teachings, you refer to shamatha, vipassana, creation, completion, devotion, guru yoga, prostrations, mantras, visualizations. Those are all hammer and nails. They're all methods. It is essential. They are essential in that the hammer and nail is important to hang the picture. As much, this is also very essential for you to realize what it means to be a Buddhist practitioner. But if your concentration doesn't really make you understand that it's all about hanging the picture, and you become enamored with the hammer and the nail, then you become dedicated club members of the Buddhist society. But other than that, the actual transcendence and transformation that should happen in the mind of a meditator, that doesn't happen. And so we collect a large number of members of Buddhists. But out of that large number of membership that we have, best thing is to become normal human beings, ordinary human beings who are and who have had the fortunate circumstance of being born human, meeting with these remarkable teachers, having a very clearly detailed outline of path of practices and of material and a treasury of material available for us to study and understand and develop our own human qualities. And so where we have all the methods, but when it comes to really cooking it, when it comes to really making the heart and the mind better, more kinder, more gentle, less aggressive, less jealous, less ignorant, less lazy, and if we don't do that, then we miss the point completely. Then there's no point. Khandro Rinpoche and Dundjom Rinpoche, the two of the greatest teachers of our times, both of them in their entire life, if you look carefully, my own teachers, other than Karmapa, Khandro Rinpoche, Dundjom Rinpoche, and Trijang Rinpoche, three of these greatest teachers of our generation had one principle in their life. They never constructed any monastery. They never wanted larger sanghas and so forth. Their students, their sons and daughters, their students, their disciples constructed monasteries and made them stay in one of them. That's a different story. But in their own life, they themselves were against the ideas of great constructions because they always followed what Padmasambhava himself said, that at the degenerate times, it is not about creating very big things. It's about being true to the path of the practices. And Dundjom Rinpoche always, his whole life, I've heard, always maintained that simple life, true life, honest life of self-reflection, that was most important. That's what Padmasambhava taught. That would be the most important cultivation in the minds of meditators. Khandro Rinpoche in his entire life always reflected upon simplicity and honest attitude to the path of the practices. Trijang Rinpoche in his whole life also, honest approach to the practice and self-reflection, self-analysis. Every word that you read, always apply it to your own mind and question and say, having read one page, how much of that I'm going to practice today? That was always how he taught, and that was always what he always emphasized. And he said, long teachings are not necessary. Maybe you read half a page, but that half page you have to cultivate, and if you're not cultivating, you question, why aren't you cultivating it? And therefore you begin to explore and question your own self. That's how meditators in our times should practice. And this is precisely, I think, when Dharma has been coming to the West, that you all should also emphasize. It's a Western world is an intelligent world. It's a world and a culture that is very, very much seeped in the culture of questioning. And the freedom of questioning, freedom of examining is there. And you are naturally aware of how to exercise that intellectual mind of yours. And when it comes to the Dharma practices that are very important, one must exert a lot of effort in doing that so that it doesn't become that we create large sanghas and so forth, and that there is a sense of duty-bound allegiance to the structure of the practices. But if genuine transformation and transcendence doesn't come, then it's such an unfortunate loss, isn't it, of this remarkable, immense preciousness of the teachings that are there. And yet those who hold the teachings, if we never allow that to be practiced in our lives, then that's very unfortunate. And so it's very interesting, if you look carefully today, is that I walk into bookstores and the religious sections, if you look at that, there's a number of Buddhist books that are there. Look at our own bookshelves at homes. If you look, now all those number, unless it's been sort of, you've not had the circumstance of buying, but if most of the houses that I stay in always seem to be houses that have hundreds of Dharma books that are all there. Now, logically speaking, someone who spends so much time with all these books and teachers and teachings and meditation, what kind of a person should be? Should come out of that. Reading a few medical books, we get a good doctor, isn't it? Reading a few law books, we have good lawyers. Whatever it is, reading some botanical books, you have a good botanist, isn't it? So it's fine. But Dharma, don't know, all those Dharma books, and yet we don't often come out to being people that resemble the material that we have access to. And so we talk about the past great teachers and bodhisattvas and so on and so forth, but in our own daily life. And we are not saying everyone should be enlightened. What we are saying is everyone should be just kinder. Everyone should be more easily forgiving of one another. That hours and hours of meditation that we spend should make us at least less stingy, less selfish, less irritable, less apprehensive, less dubious and doubtful of the others constantly. Why can't we, as Buddhist meditators who are out to liberate all sentient beings, not have a little bit of tolerance to the people who have been mean to us, or to people that we don't necessarily agree with? That in our mind, instead of being so affronted with the insults and with the defamations or whatever different criticisms that may be there, that probably 5 minutes of genuine tolerance and wishing good for the other people is something that we could do in our own minds. And why can't we do that? That is an important question that you have to ask yourself. The whole meaning that you have in your life of having met with the Dharma should result in the fruition of a much more gentle and an honest heart, honest mind. That's the key point. If you can achieve that, becoming a Buddha or a Bodhisattva isn't very difficult. Human being and becoming honest with your humanness, that's the most difficult thing to do. Think about it for tonight. I'll stop here. And then the next section goes into the paramita section. So I'll just continue with that tomorrow. Okay? I don't know. Do you have questions? Yes.
Rinpoche, I'd like to respectfully ask that you return someday to our region and teach the creation and completion by Jumgun Khandro Rinpoche.
I never really understood what happened in all this, but creation completion is a very important topic. It's a very important topic. And sure, why not? As I've always believed in the power of aspirations. It's an interesting age and time that we live in today. Dharma, as it's been taught right up to our generation, has been taught as authentically as possible. You have to remember the kind of teachers that we have had, the fortunate circumstances. I myself find that maybe me and my age group, the unfortunate factor is most of our senior teachers had passed away before we actually knew what we were doing, I think. We received a lot of teachings, but at that age when you receive teachings, it's very different. So, of course, I cannot say for others. There are some very great teachers who've received teachings, and at a very young age, they may have had great capacity. But for myself, I know that if I were a little bit older, probably the way I would have understood it then, but one never knows. The mind can be tricky at all ages, I think. But even so, even with that little bit of understanding, what you do find is the remarkable openness, kindness, and genuineness in which way the teachings were imparted. Now it becomes the responsibility of the current generation of teachers to be able to hold that same tradition. And we cannot even sort of attempt to imitate, I would say. Not just do it, but even to imitate what our teachers and how our teachers were is just a dog attempting a lion's leap. It's never possible. But even if you were to exert a lot of effort, you have to try and keep self-agenda definitely away from religion and from philosophy and imparting of philosophy. Dharma has never been copyrighted. I don't know where we got that whole thing about copyright of Dharma. Basic structure, if I am to be honest, is that very few people are concerned about Dharma, and we are mostly concerned about membership. That's where it is. Schools of Buddhism, lineages, and the different kinds of historically, all the sort of politics in lineages and schools of Buddhism have also evolved, not because of teachers or the value of the teachings or whatever it is. The cause is always few things. One is real estate, second is membership, and third is income. Take these three things out, everyone will be quite harmonious with one another, because then there's nothing else as an agenda to achieve. Real estate is a big problem, and that's why many of our teachers never built, and that was because they knew that your loyalties, no matter how unbiased you were, as soon as you have real estate, you do have a problem. You have to have bias, you have to have priorities, you have to give one importance over the other, and there are many different factors that come into being. So unfortunately, in today's times where we have to struggle with this, and there's a lot of commercial aspects and political aspects that have come in, some of us have gotten into a system where we are, I think, allowing mundane issues become more important than Dharma. But the good thing is karma, I think. The flow of karma is something that is very powerful. And as I said, good aspirations and good effort from meditators, good situations always will evolve. So one mustn't be afraid of challenges and difficulties. There's always make good aspirations and learn the Dharma well. In my life, I've always had to encounter certain difficulties. And from a very young age, whenever I had difficulties, I would always ask Cultivating Rinpoche always, so what should I do? And Rinpoche would always say the solution to any difficulties within the context of Dharma is education. Educate people well, and then each person makes one's own individual decision. Otherwise, we'll get into a game of you are right, I am right, you are wrong, I am wrong kind of a situation. Blame game starts. And that's not a solution at all, because in many ways, any decision that is made, everyone makes with a good intention. It's not with the intention to harm or hurt somebody else. Most of the decisions we make are decisions that we make with the intention of having given that situation a lot of good thought. So creation and completion is a subject that was a topic that was suggested in the beginning. Then something happened and the topics got a little bit changed. And I was thinking about it at some point, and I thought, what would be a good way to use this situation? And I thought, that's good. Actually, my speaking on creation and completion probably wouldn't have been heard so much as my not speaking on creation and completion. So, it's good. It's good, isn't it? But copywriting of Dharma, that's a little bit of an issue here, I think. And how can you categorize a person into any kind of a category? Even the Buddhas never did it, A person's individual karma is very different. Each individual person in a room is a different person, and you have to respect that. You are different, she's different, he's different. Everyone is different person and a complete individual in whole. And you cannot segregate people and say, all of us today are going to be Hinayanist. All of us tomorrow are going to be a Mahayanist. And then 2010, everyone's going to be Vajrayanist. That is a little bit difficult. I don't know how you would do it. But, in this world, new ideas are always evolving. So one can't say we can't do it. But it is not taking into consideration the fact that every person must be respected as an individual. And the pace has to be individual. The teachings have to be individual. The training has to be individual. So this is a big topic of conversation. That's there, definitely. But to keep things more direct is creation and completion, especially if you've begun Vajrayana practice, I feel is a very important subject. Because that's the crucial moment where, if not understood correctly, your idea of Vajrayana becomes very theistic. And so understanding the true essence. And Jamgon Khandro Rinpoche's Chezok Nedu, the first introduction to creation and completion, is a very wonderful book. The translation is very excellent, and the root text itself opens the body. But that's not only the subject. Creation and completion has been explained in many ways. Recently, a new book has come out. I haven't read it, but I browsed through it, and seems like an excellent book also for you to read, if you're allowed to read.
Which one is that?
Development. Does anyone remember the title?
There's 4 translations in the one book. There's a
Yes.
Staircase to Akanishi, and 3 other texts. One of them is Cultivating.
Yes. I have the book in my suitcase. I'll read the title and come tomorrow.
Thank you, Rinpoche.
I think it's development and completion stage. I think that was what it is called. But it's a very wonderful book, as you said, of 4 teachers who've explained the same topic in 4 different styles. But then again, the thing is, receive teachings from many people. Bay Area is so lucky, so very fortunate, that it has accessibility to so many teachers. It isn't talking about spiritual shopping. Some people have this idea of just shopping for more and more, and because in order to sort of stop that kind of a materialistic idea, supermarket kind of a idea of religion or spirituality, many teachers say don't shop. Spiritual shopping is something that you shouldn't do. You should remain true. But extremes of both are difficult to do. So in today's times, you should receive a lot of teachings. There are many excellent teachers. You should receive teachings from them. Not restrict yourself to just one lineage. But ultimately, then you have your own practice to do. Khandro Rinpoche, up to the last years of his life, never ever missed a chance of receiving transmissions. At the age of 80, if you and I were as learned and realized as Khandro Rinpoche, would we really think we were in need of receiving one more oral transmission from a monk you never met and knew in your life ever before? I think not, isn't it? But Rinpoche wasn't like that. At that time, when he had to be supported by 4 people for him to sit straight and to walk, if he ever knew that there was a person who had a transmission that he hadn't received before, he would go and make an effort to sit lower than that person and receive that transmission. So it's that kind of a tradition where teachers exerted that effort to understand and to see the value and the treasury of what you had. That's just this previous generation. And today we read 2-3 books and then we say, oh, this is it, this is what I should be true to, and so forth. That's a little bit, I think, arrogant and a little bit of isolation of your own self. That shouldn't be done. Then on the other hand, then there's this whole, what do you call that, bandwagon of spiritual shoppers and marketing, where you never settle down in one practice and you just think that you rub off the energy of the other person and you survive on the energies of the other people. That's, again, another extreme that you should avoid. So, as a Buddhist, be sensible. That's what it is all about. Okay? Yes? Mm-hmm.
Could you say a little something if there's a difference between the practice of contemplation and analytical meditation, and what those differences might be?
Contemplation requires, the first is contemplation, but hearing, it has to be sequential. Hearing, contemplating, meditating, and then putting it into action. There's a lot of wisdom in this sequence here. One must listen to a lot of teachings. Listen also requires reading. Listening and reading are both the same thing. You should read a lot, you should listen to a lot of teachings, but you shouldn't listen to teachings and immediately believe in something. You have to listen, and then after that comes contemplation. You have to think about what you heard and see whether it's applicable to you, seems right to you, doesn't seem right to you. The Buddhist path cannot really give you the benefits and the result if you do not have one thing, and that is certainty. And certainty cannot be given to you at all. Certainty has to be cultivated through your own effort of analysis, of contemplation. When you contemplate, and you think about what you have heard, think about what you have read, you'll come to a moment where it will immediately, naturally evolve as analysis and examination. You'll have to study more, you'll have to hear more, so that the contemplation assists the analysis. And so you analyze, you examine whether it is true or not, applicable, not applicable, how can it be true, how can it not be true. And the contemplation and the analysis must go to such a moment where you find a final answer that completely satisfies you. Satisfies you, not the lazy you, but the you that really can have the courage to see the truth. When you find the sense or the meaning of that you discover from that analysis and contemplation, then you become familiar with it. Familiarization with your own exploration is called meditation. So when you say, I'm sitting in meditation you're not doing anything but making what you have discovered something that you're familiar with. As familiar as any mundane things that you become familiar with, likewise with what you have found in your reflection and in your contemplation. That is what you become familiar with. That develops certainty. So meditation develops certainty. And the certainty is then that which is applied to the conduct of body, speech, and mind. And so contemplation is thinking about what you have heard, what you have read, and then that what you have read and heard, when it is further analyzed to actually see if it is true or not, that you can be certain of it. That is called analysis.
So this is done within the context of sitting meditation and post-sitting meditation?
Yes, both, in both the cases. But analytical meditation has two ways. There is a structured, formal way of analyzing, and there's an informal analysis. Structured, formal analysis is most often emphasized in sitting meditation. Informal analysis is most often in post-meditation.
Rinpoche, thank you for being here. This afternoon we had a short discussion at lunch, and one of the things that came up I'd just like to get a little clarification about. Some of us have read that there's individual and collective karma. Mm-hmm. And so from that arose the question of what happens if our collective karma is to be born into a situation like we are now, that our particular country is at war. And my sense of it is that you might say something along the lines that it would be helpful to deepen our own practice, and then education, as you said a few minutes ago, would be the way to address that, to really...
It's true. Collective karma is... but individual karma is more powerful than collective karma. You have to know that. Collective karma creates an environment. How you stir the environment is dependent on the individual karma. So the collective karma can influence, let's say, creating an environment of violence. But if the individual is strong, one individual can actually turn the entire collective karma also. Yes?
Hi. Some years ago, the Dorje Lopan Lodro Dorje was giving a teaching here, and he said something that I never could forget, is I keep confusing mind with what's between my two ears. And you've been talking about transforming mind today. Do you mean transforming thoughts? Or is there something else you mean by transforming your mind?
From a lesser potential, it's transforming thoughts. But then you become tired and you know that it's inexhaustible. You can't transform all of them. So the middling potential goes to the questioning of the first one. It begins to not be satisfied with just transforming of thoughts. In the lesser potential, you think mind and thoughts are the same. The middling potential is just a maturation of that where it is dissatisfied with that answer. And it says it cannot be because it's inexhaustible. There must be something deeper. And that's where Hinayana transcends to becoming Mahayana, is where you begin to come to roots. And at the Mahayana level, where you begin to develop the greater potential, is where you're not transcending thoughts, you're transcending mind, and that is at a much more conscious level, consciousness level. But then that is also not it, and you get greater dissatisfaction, that is, the consciousness is also not the mind that we are talking about. So that then opens up, as we just reached the section here, is it then begins to talk about relative and absolute truth, refers to mind relatively as consciousness and absolute as its inner essence, the nature.
Thank you.
Okay? In the Mahamudra tradition, this would be the sort of question between seventh consciousness and the eighth consciousness, the afflictive mind consciousness and the all-ground alaya, or the primordial nature. So mind, from that perspective, would be the primordial ground. There are different ways to refer to it: Buddha nature, or just the primordial ground, or alaya. And the mistaken belief that it is the consciousness would be the afflictive consciousness, and all the different patterns from where thoughts would also evolve. And so it's a process. When we talk about potential and transcending of mind, we're just working with trying to see what is mind. So thoughts are not mind. Consciousness is also not mind. Mind as I see is also not mind. Then the question comes is, ultimately, then what is it that I'm trying to transform? What is it that I'm trying to work with? That question is very pivotal. It's very important. And so it's a gentle way of approaching you to questioning what is mind. Mind is not thoughts. Mind is not consciousness. Mind is not what we call mind itself, isn't it? Therefore, what is its fundamental nature? That's a question you have to come up with yourself. Rather than someone telling you, look at what is the nature of mind, you'd have to say, I wonder what is the nature of my mind. If thoughts are not mine, if this is also not mine, if that is also not mine, all of that I thought was mind is not mind. What I feel here is not mind. What I feel here is not mine. Then what is mind? That question that you yourself develop, this would be analysis. Then that would be a much more sort of direct meditation that you would do to yourself. Yes?
Could you speak some more about not becoming discouraged? Because I feel overwhelmed by the strength of my obscurations.
I think it has to do a lot about knowing what religion is. Do you see Dharma as religion or as philosophy? You yourself. What do you feel more comfortable referring it as?
Religion.
As a religion?
Yeah.
Then you have to. I think it comes with stigmas of what we think religion is. You know, people think you cannot understand Buddhism very well if you don't stop being too good. Number one. You know, this whole stigma that religion has. As religious people, you have to be too good, too pious, too pure, too sort of good, I guess. So Buddhism cannot be understood. We're not saying it isn't what Buddhism is. Buddhism has to be understood from a sense of deep appreciation. That means relaxed appreciation. You have to have a very relaxed attitude to who you are, without coming into the structures of becoming this way and that way and this way and that way. One of the interesting things you find is Western world has never been able to understand Buddhist monasticism, for example. Becoming a monk and becoming a nun from the Western perspectives, I think becomes very difficult, because what is a Christian monk, what is a Christian nun, for example, isn't what Buddhist monks and nuns are like in that way, especially Tibetan Buddhists. But what I found, recently I had the opportunity of studying what it means to be a nun from a Catholic perspective, just really going into it. And then I thought, if that is the attitude, what you think is a Buddhist nun, and then you bring into it, no wonder many Buddhist nuns, often I find, are struggling, because they have this piety and purity and pureness and sacrifice and sadness and sort of giving up and so on and so forth. Whereas traditional Buddhism is all not so worried about being that perfect or being that too good or too pure. And so the uptightness of the religious ideas, the stigmas of uptight behavior, that does a lot of damage, I think, to Buddhist practitioners also. And no one demands it of you, but there's almost a sense that because you're a Buddhist, you cannot be normal, you cannot be ordinary, you cannot be honest, and you have to do something. You have to walk differently, talk differently, think differently, speak differently, behave differently. That creates a lot of, I think, tension in the meditator of having to live a life that you're not very familiar with. And so out of that, the ease, the natural ease that a meditator should develop doesn't happen, and one becomes. For example, people often, I've always noticed, is that in Buddhist communities, you don't make friends among yourself. As much as possible, you try to make friends outside of a Buddhist community because that's where the normalcy is. Yes, isn't it? And within the community, why that happens is there's this immense tension of having to be profound all the time, having to be good and having to be non-dualistic and selfless and, bashing your ego up all the time and so forth. That almost is there. That creates a lot of tension and discourages you from actually being in ease with who you are. In the traditional Buddhist environment, if you see, there's a lot of lightheartedness, a sense of gaiety, there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of humor at making mistakes, humor at the consequences of all the things, mistakes or errors that you have made, and a sense of not taking yourself that seriously, which has to be understood correctly. It's not a flippancy or a frivolousness with the idea, but there's a lot of ease that has to be developed. And so it's almost a sense of we're all on a journey of bettering ourselves. We're not on a journey where we start by being perfect. Isn't it? And so when that is not understood, unnecessary tension comes in and people become discouraged because you keep comparing to all the ideas. And then we don't compare ourselves with our neighbors or with our Sangha members, Vajra brothers and sisters. We always compare ourselves with Marpa and Mila and Shanti Deva and Nagarjuna and so forth. And that's not correct. None of us are able to do that. So being able to have a correct attitude of what it means to be a Buddhist, and that's always the goal is truth, and the journey is based upon honesty. But the only thing that you need to keep in mind is that the honesty must not be at the cost of happiness of the others. You have to learn to be honest, but always develop so that the honesty is true and becomes more and more genuine, more and more pure. Only then truth can be realized. And so the discouragement often is because I think people just keep too much expectations on your own self. That's not necessary. There's no one's expectation of you other than your own expectations of your own self. Ultimately, you have to realize that. And the other thing is that there's this whole question, I'm disappointing my teachers, I'm disappointing the people who have even if you receive transmissions for prostrations, and if you're not able to keep up the prostrations, you sort of feel very guilty about it. In the Buddhist tradition, there is no teacher who will feel bad about having given you transmissions on prostrations and that you didn't do. The only thing they will say is, well, it's your karma. If you're not afraid of your karma, then there's not much I can do about it. Isn't it? Teacher's attitude will always be like that. There's no teacher who will say, oh, I gave you the refuge and I gave you the bodhisattva, I gave you this empowerment and you didn't do that. There's no one who blames you for not having done it. It's a sense of, it was given to me, I have given it to you. Then now, if you do not value it yourself, there's not much I can do about your own karma. Isn't it? And so every individual is given the freedom to find one's own pace, and you have to be able to understand that. And that, I think, is very important in not sort of feeling guilty and disappointed in yourself and sort of disappointing the teachers or the teachings and the discouragement, the different aspects of discouragement that comes, I think is really not necessary. A sense of humor about your own self is very important. So being too perfect, too good, that's always been a problem. And I think Khandro Rinpoche, if you see his whole life, it's the same thing, is that this whole religiosity and the idea of very good and very nice and very thing, this is If it is true, then that's very nice. But if it is not true, then that's not fabricated so much. So that was what he taught, and that is, I think, what you should keep in mind.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes?
Oh, okay, thank you. Hello, Rinpoche. Thank you for being here. Oh, so.
Oh, okay.
I'll talk to you later. But I have a question about something that's come up in my Dharma life. I let TV sort of fell away from me because I didn't like what I was seeing. But now, in order to spend some time with my mother at night, I have to go upstairs and listen to TV with her. And sometimes, it really upsets me. My mind is like too fragile somehow. If I hear something like a rape and then I hear it sounds so real and I get very upset. And sometimes I have to tell her I have to go to bed now and this and that. What can you do when you get too sensitive? Is there a way of coming back to being more tough somehow if you need, because you need to be out in the world and benefiting others. So what do you do with that?
I think the more you fight, the harder it gets.
Okay.
I don't think so there's a cause. If you think that this is going to be listening to what you hear on the TV is more distracting or disturbing to you, and you keep thinking, oh, this is causing it, the more you talk about it, the more you think about it, it's going to get worse and worse. Mm-hmm. I think the best way to do it is not see it as so difficult. It's only how many minutes per night?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
It's
the rest of the time, what do you do?
I'm not watching it.
See?
Yeah.
So that moment could probably be used the way you think would be good. And the moment that are not under your control, let it be. At that moment, you're there for your mother.
Right.
Not to be a Buddhist.
Right. So I got that problem. Touché. Thank you so much, Rinpoche. More laughter.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of mothers, I'm struggling with understanding karma as our own separate path, and then also where that ties into family members or people we encounter. So for me, I struggle with the connection with my own mother and then my own children, and where is our karma linked? Where is it separate? Where can I let go? Where do I have
There isn't
influence?
going to be a moment where we can separate karma. We can sense where there are very strong karma and where there are less impactful karma. That is possible. Sometimes the person that you are most close to, you may have very less connection with that person. It may be very, very, let's say, fragile and very, very new karma connection with that person. So, however, there may be some people with whom the karmic connection is very much. Let's say, for example, there are some people who may do certain things and the impact is not what you feel so much. This may be your child, or this may be your mother or father, or your husband or partner, or whatever it may be. And no matter what that person does, you don't feel it that strongly. That's less impactful karma. Then there are some people whose smallest thing aggravate you, whether it is aggravation of happiness or aggravation of pain or suffering. Very strong, and that is where the karmic debt is very strong, where the impact of the karma is very strong. So less impactful and very deep impact karma is there, but you cannot say, I'm not karmically connected with anyone, especially when it comes to family members. And you have karmic connection with everyone, number one. Then let's continue. Yes. Therefore?
I'll just cut to the chase. Mm-hmm. Is it ever okay? You used a line yesterday of your father's that never say no to anybody. Is it ever okay to say, to shut the door?
Are you being kind?
To the rest of my family?
Yes, then it's good. Someone like our teachers could probably come to a life when they're able to have this happiness to the others. Ultimately, everything is your own mind's creation. You have to keep that in mind. Good things are your mind and bad things are your own mind. Check your intention. If your intention is good, all karmas are good. Okay? Don't be afraid of that. Yes.
Thank you, Rinpoche. Thank you so much for coming and teaching. I have a question about anger. You gave a lot of helpful teachings about anger, and it's something that I struggle with. So let's say that you're not a perfect practitioner, and here I'm not talking about myself. And part of your teachings, you were saying that indulging anger. You said this obviously much more articulately than I will, but indulging anger is not okay and things like this. But as someone who might not be a perfect practitioner, there are times when this will happen. Anger will be indulged, and there's just so much energy inherent in anger. What I wonder is what to do with that anger, with that energy, with all of that energy. It's in your body, and I see people sometimes repress it, but that's still anger. It's being repressed.
I used to have a lot of difficulty with anger. Things upset me, and then it would be. But over years, what I've learned is it doesn't really help, and there's so much truth. Everyone's been telling me, all my teachers tell me, anger doesn't help. But you never believe in that, isn't it? But however, over the years, what I find is nobody actually listens to you. Yeah. No matter how angry you are, and in that anger, no matter how much you try to say, nobody listens to you anyways. It doesn't help. So other than your own sort of waste of energy and holding on, so you ultimately have to come and say, are you going to make it 3 hours or are you going to make it 15 minutes? Today I'm at a point in my life where I think I can be quite happy is that I do get angry still very much, but I can make it short. Yes. Because the problem is, you see, I live with so many people, and and what happens is the aftermath of having been angry and then having to go and console everybody and say it's all right, that takes so much time. That dealing with my own anger and keeping things short so that tomorrow morning the whole schedule doesn't get upside down because of my anger, having now, people have meltdowns and overwhelming things, and their faith and their devotion on the path of practice gets challenged because of my anger and so forth. And you have to then again go back to dealing with all those situations. That tires me so much. So it's much better if I don't get angry, then tomorrow's schedule stays intact.
Well, if I may say, I'm very lucky that people's faith and devotion and things don't get impacted by my anger.
But they do. It's in a different way. Trust and faith, belief in a person, the ability to love that person and not to be hesitant about how you express yourself to that person, those get affected. Yeah. You have to think about the downsides of what anger does to you and the immense amount of correction that you have to spend time doing it in yourself and to the others. The example that I gave of my own self, that applies to everyone else. And therefore, you have to be able to see it just doesn't help anybody. Primarily, it ruins your own self. Your own inner happiness and your own abilities are harmed by anger and aggression. And it looks like and pent-up energy that's always there, and resentment is all there. And it's definitely not going to vanish with one attempt or two attempts. It's a lifelong process where I think the best way to start it is recognize yourself getting angry and then be able to really wait a little bit. At one time, we were receiving an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama at that time. And he said, towards the end of the day, I often get very short-tempered. And what I have decided now is that I'm never going to make a decision after sunset. That I will not follow any decision and wait until I've slept it. I've kept that in my mind, and it is a very helpful thing, is that anything that you feel shouldn't be expressed immediately. Give it time. What you do to yourself and how much you take time to work within yourself, that's your own work. But making sure that it isn't immediately expressed to the others, where others are hurt or harmed by it, that's limiting the angers repercussions or sort of the negative energy that is given to the outward. And then when it is your own personal anger and energy of the anger that you feel, then you have more time to work with yourself. It's not the immediate. When it is immediately given out to the others, then it's an uncontrolled state. When it is inside of your own self, you have much more time to look at it, think about it, examine it, and then slowly let it relax its hold over you, isn't it? So there are two aspects to it. So don't get angry to the others. But if the aggression is still something that you feel within your own self at that moment, work with it slowly. Don't imagine it will disappear immediately. Work with it slowly. And the best thing I have found myself is shorten the duration with which you live with it. Even if it is 3 days, then make it 2.5 days, 2 days. Very slowly, but gradually shorten the period of time that you mull over that point, the sore point within your own self. That's always a much more, I would say, a much more practical approach to working with it. Yes.
Chogyam Trungpa had a concept known as idiot compassion, and I wanted to hear your sort of view on compassion versus idiot compassion.
If you have an agenda, life of agenda, every compassion becomes idiot compassion. And then simply being able to live a life without a selfish agenda of your own always being outplayed is possible. And as meditators, that is what you should be doing. Is you are kind just because it is good to be kind, just because it's what you could do. That's about the only sensible thing that we can do while we are alive, isn't it? And so out of that, selflessly, if you are able to be kind and helpful to the other people, then I don't think you have to be afraid of being compassionate in an idiotic way. The idiot compassion doesn't become much of a problem. Idiot compassion is where, you want the best of both the worlds, samsara and nirvana both. And you have a selfish agenda, but you disguise it so beautifully with all sacred terms. And then you try to be, that's where patronizing attitudes come in, where ego display of your compassion comes in. Those are displays of idiot compassion, which is very important. And then to be compassionate so that you feel better, or it sort of serves your purpose. You've done it. And so you want to get over your own guilt. You want to sort of display your own arrogance and your own ego. And many people do that. We all try to become bodhisattvas, but it's a very selfish motivation in many ways, is because we want to prove others are wrong, most often times. And that is what we think is being a bodhisattva. That's idiot compassion. That's where you're trying to be compassionate, and then you hurt people left and right in your display of compassion. That's very prevalent in the Buddhist world, for example, is where everyone wants to be compassionate, but it is me feeling compassion, doesn't matter how badly you're hurt, in my trying to achieve this compassionate persona of my own self. And so that is where self's agenda, it's a very important thing to think about. Then agendas can be very big and agendas can be very subtle that you may not even recognize what is there. There are many people who say things like, I love to teach. This is very common in the Buddhist world. And I love teaching others because there is so much that you can gain from teaching others. It's a good statement. But on the other hand, it's filled with display sometimes, with display of arrogance, with display of not applying the teachings to your own self, but making others do it, for example. Those are subtle agendas that we think are not bad, but still are a major display of our own basic ignorance, basic pride, and ego and arrogance. So when that is displayed and the self-agenda becomes very, very strong all the time, very often that influences the kindness and compassion that we have, and that becomes idiot compassion. A very dangerous thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
It's also the question with sort of discouragement within one's own self is that when you try to cover up guilt by being compassionate, or when you try to cover up laxing in meditation, formal meditation by being compassionate. But it's all about, your own basic hope and fear that you cover up by pretending to be kind or by pretending to be compassionate. That kind of attitude is often called the idiot compassion. I'm going to be compassionate. It may hurt you all, but then it doesn't matter. I have to be compassionate because I've taken my bodhisattva vow. When that kind of priorities are mistaken, and genuine kindness is not there, but the sort of label of kindness dominates genuine kindness, that's giving into idiot compassion. Fearlessness is not there. When you're afraid, then often the compassion is idiot compassion. So fearlessness has to be there. Not the brash, careless kind of fearlessness, but the fearlessness of not having an agenda to achieve, and therefore you can have the freedom to just be normal kind, I guess, would be the word. Okay? Yes.
As someone that's grown up with the teachings, you talked earlier about contemplating death. When do you think it's appropriate to introduce that topic to kids? At what age? So you don't frighten them, but you make them understand the importance of understanding suffering through realizing death.
I think early on, there's no particular age that one can talk. I think any Dharma topic is very dangerous when you generalize everyone. I said that before also. When you generalize and say this is the common thing that everyone can do, then it's never right. Dharma should always be taught taking into consideration individual potentials of the person. Some people have a very early on a life that has the potential of understanding death and what impermanence is and what to do with it. Some people don't develop that even at old age. We're not willing to listen to what death is and so forth. So it cannot be generalized. But just sort of thinking about it is, I think early on might be good, just when life becomes very interesting and nice enough that you don't want to lose it, might be a good time when you can then introduce the understanding that it may not remain with you always. Okay, yes, last question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your teachings, Rinpoche. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what to do when one feels disconnected from their own Buddha nature.
Can you be disconnected from your Buddha nature?
You could feel disconnected.
Oh, it doesn't mean you're disconnected.
Right, but what if you can't really, what if you don't have confidence that you are connected?
I think then you would take refuge. You would then have to depend on someone else. And there's no harm in doing that. Outer three jewels and the inner three jewels basically are the same thing. What is Dharma has to be taken in the right way. Dharma isn't one thing that you have to adhere to. Dharma is and should be transformed into whatever is going to be most useful for you at that moment in your life. It has been explained in enough different ways for people of all stratas or all abilities and needs to be able to derive something from Dharma. So Buddha's teachings were never said, this is the form and everyone must adhere to this form. That's never it is. It's a gamut of different pervasive, flexible ways of presenting the teachings, and people individually, as where you are and what kind of a moment you are having at that moment, can relate to Dharma in that way. So let's take just three things, Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha nature, for example, is inherent. If you can take refuge in that, then that's very good. If you can't, then always relate to the Buddha outside. And that's also very much there. Our hopes and our fears, our struggles in life and our understanding in life is such at this moment that we're all totally dependent upon others. We are dependent on others for our happiness. We are dependent on others for protection. We are dependent on others for not having suffering. We're dependent on others for our success, growth, and development. We're dependent on others for teachings, wisdom, and understanding. We're dependent on methods and people, isn't it? So where there is immense dependency on the other, at moments where you feel disconnected from your own inherent nature, to be dependent upon the enlightened blessings of the Buddhas, the enlightened teachers, the enlightened great bodhisattvas who manifest and still continue to guide us on the path of the practice, and relying upon them to gain stability of the mind is not a bad thing to do.
So, like saying a refuge prayer over
Definitely.
and over?
I would say. To take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, to take refuge and know that our abilities are very limited, but there is great wisdom and compassion in all the great masters and all the great bodhisattvas. And their aspiration is continued, and their aspiration is very powerful. Therefore, allowing your mind to receive the guidance and to receive the blessings of the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, or the three roots or the three jewels or the bodhisattvas, and turning into taking refuge or just being able to recite a few mantras, but where you get the sense of protection and blessings of the three jewels, I think is very important for meditators. Sometimes I think we overestimate our own capacities and we rely too much upon our own mind, which is obscured at this moment. So because of not being able to really have the wisdom and then not relying on anything that is wise either, we're lost in many cases. And so as long as you're in a relative world, there is no harm in relating to the relativity either. So long as we don't stagnate over there.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. So we can stop here for this evening. And thank you all those who've worked hard throughout the day in making it possible for us all to be here and dedicating the merit to all the sentient beings and being very mindful of what we have spoken, and that knowing that simply empty promises and dedications aren't going to help if we are not able to correct our own attitudes and our conducts. And so more than anything else that you can ever do for the sentient being is to make sure that the actions, the remaining hours that you have before you fall asleep tonight, is that the actions of the body, speech, and mind be a cause of happiness to the others. And the least you can do is that it doesn't become a cause of unhappiness to the others. Watch your action. Watch the karma that you create.